So, you talk about how the writers, the creators, the people behind the scenes wanted to do this. I would love to be able to say how things are so much different now. I, I think you agree with me. It's just we're going backwards here, culturally speaking, socially speaking. But it seems like in the 1980s, I guess it would be easy to say that in the 1980s, it probably was we were less progressive as a country than we are now. We've got challenges still ahead, unfortunately. But so why? I guess what's the motivation for these folks to do that? To create a show like that where it's again, it's not as I guess right. I think I could fairly see in the 80s. Look, we had the AIDS epidemic. There was more homophobia as a result. So folks weren't as out, and it wasn't as safe at the time. So why would a group of folks want to do that? I guess, or motivated to do that at the time.
Yeah, I mean, your whole show is about the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
And like, it's fun to go back to the 1980s and think about the amazing pop culture that came out of that time period. But another important part of going back to the 1980s is to think about what the political moment was in which that pop culture we love was able to emerge, right?
Right.
And the political context for Pee-wee's Playhouse to be able to emerge in the way it did was very much two things. First being the AIDS crisis, right? Like, this was a period of time where gay men in particular, and men who have sex with men, were being abandoned by the state, who wasn't recognizing this illness that was decimating populations of queer people, of brown and black people, of people who use drugs. And there was a real anger and rage and also grief and mourning that came out of that. So for this show, Pee-wee's Playhouse, to be queer coded in this way and to celebrate queer culture was really meaningful within that context of feeling like really not seen and really abandoned and left to die. And then the other political context in the 1980s that's important for Pee-wee's Playhouse is the way that the 1980s approached masculinity, right? So this
Right.
is like a period of Reaganism. There's like this celebration of like rugged, autonomous masculinity. Think of like the Marlboro Man. Think of like Reagan as this kind of cowboy figure. This idea of like returning to the 1950s and like white suburban life and really rigid gender roles. These were all sort of big politicized cultural ideas in the 1980s that Pee-wee's Playhouse was really critiquing and responding to by putting forward this really other vision of what it could look like to be part of a family, to be in a domestic space, and to do masculinity really differently, because he was such a sissy in this completely unapologetic and wonderful and like wild and playful way.
Wow. I never look at the time I watched it, and I was older than you were, obviously, when I first saw it. But none of this occurred to me. But what did occur to me was I identified it with him in a way that I think I'm not gay, but I think the way queerness is even described. There's this quote in your book. You're quoting someone else whom I apologize. I don't remember who. Queerness can be understood in part through this collective attachment. That's not what I wanted to read. Shoot. Oh, here it is. Um, when you shoot, is this talking about? You know what? That's not going to work. But I'll cut that out. But there's some of the ways you talk about queerness in the show and the queer coding are things that I responded to. This idea of the other, this idea of the outsider. I didn't identify with any of those masculine, stereotypes that you're, and I was always a person who felt like motivated to just, or I wanted to be able to be myself, and he was a character. I felt like he gave me permission to be more ridiculous and whatever
Yeah.
that wound up being.
Yeah. And to like be a masculine person in whatever way felt authentic and true to you, right? Because
Right.
like that's what gender on Pee-wee's Playhouse was like. It wasn't like this rigid system that you had to bend your desires and your sense of self to fit into. It was like a form of play in a way that you could express yourself. And like most children's media, children's toys, children's popular culture in the 80s was like so organized around a gender binary, right? Like I
Right.
grew up, another show that two shows that I really liked were like He-Man and She-Ra,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which
Yeah.
were very popular came out not in the 80s, but were very popular in the 1980s. And it was like boys watched He-Man and girls watched She-Ra. And of course, like people, you know, watch both of those shows, but it was like thought of as transgressive,
Right.
or like you were doing the wrong thing if you liked the kind of media that wasn't for your gender. And Pee-wee's Playhouse was like really not trying to not be a show for boys or a show for girls. It was a show for kids. And that really opened up a kind of liberating space for, like you said, all kinds of viewers, not just queer viewers, who felt really alienated from masculinity or femininity as it was, promoted and practiced in a more like mainstream and dominant way.
I'm sure the it's not, the word's not irony, but I'm sure it's not lost on you that so much of what you're describing about the 80s seems applicable today. This idea that where folks are they're longing for the 1950s and longing for 2 lanes of gender roles, and it's disappointing to me. I can't imagine. I imagine it's even more disappointing to you, having sort of studied things like this, and maybe the short-term impact of folks like Pee-wee that only to get you sort of dragged back.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have this idea that as we move forward in time, our cultures become more progressive and more accepting of gender difference and sexual difference. And in some ways that's true, right? Like at the very least, we're living in a time right now where there's a lot more visibility, for example, of transgender folks in our current moment. But that heightened visibility has also come along with this huge right-wing backlash that is really trying to limit the gender expression of kids and young people, for example, in ways that were really similar to how the 1980s was quite rigid and organized around gender roles. So, when I was writing this book and thinking about Pee-wee Herman in the 1980s, I was really struck by a lot of the similarities and resonances between how gender worked in the 1980s and how it is operating right now. Because we're living in, I think, a really scary time around, the ability of especially queer and trans kids to be able to live safely, go to school in dignity, and have their basic rights respected.
Right. I know we're here to talk about your book, but I just got to say, it just pisses me off to no end. Why can't people just mind their own damn business? That has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
It just, and it seems like the same folks who will complain about a neighbor's ball going into the yard don't understand that these attitudes they have are a similar idea. You're encroaching on someone else's rights. We're not asking you to do more than, we're just asking you to stay within the bounds of your rights. But no.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's talk about some specifics about the show, which I thought was interesting how you thought about these, including the fact that when we're, hearkening back to the 1950s, and also the fact that the show came out in the 1980s, an era which, technology was booming, for example. And I argue oftentimes, only somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I'd like to finish doing the research to prove this, but that it was maybe more, this is going to sound ridiculous, saying to an academic,
Yep.
It's a fancier word for that, an academic, but that 10 years of growth in the 1980s, or maybe we had, so whatever, I'm not even gonna say that to you. You're too smart for that. You'll just shoot me down.
No, say it.
I was going to say that it's, I want to say it's even, it was more of a renaissance than, the medieval renaissance in a sense. That one took a long time and was spread across countries. But in 10 years, you saw all these evolutions, including technological. And you have this show that is a throwback to the 1950s when we had this sort of atomic age, they had fun with the predictions of the 80s would be. And in the 80s, we had, some other technology that was trying to be the precursor to things we have today. And in the middle of this silly kids show, you have some things that are, prescient. But they're more they're kind of along the lines of, they're also subversive in a sense that you were sort of talking about earlier, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the 80s was the rise of like 2 new technologies that were really important in changing our culture. So the first was the personal computer, right? So the idea for the first time that computers became miniaturized, and they could be single machines that regular people had in their workplace or in their home. So this is the beginning of this like computing revolution. And the second thing that's new is computer networks, right? So the computer networks that became the precursor to the internet in the 1990s those start in the 1980s. And I'm talking about like bulletin board systems. And
Right.
so there's this ability for people, mostly nerds, to be able
I was on them.
yeah, to be able to communicate about niche topics with people who like
Right.
you didn't know, right? Like stuff you were, a fan of, with people you didn't know in real life who were spread far away from you geographically. And so the world, through these advances in computing, the world starts to get smaller in a way, and our everyday communication practices and even processes in our household become computerized really, really quickly. So think, for example, of like for the first time, you'd be able to program your VCR in the 1980s because it has a tiny computer in it. You could tell it when you want to record a show. It seems like a small thing now, but these are big changes. Computing is becoming like more embedded just in the everyday lives of regular people. And all that is to say that Pee-wee's Playhouse is taking shape during this cultural moment of really rapid technological transformation that, like you pointed out, Will, is similar in a lot of ways to the 1950s, where there's this post-war kind of Cold War obsession with the space race and nuclear technology, and the idea that investment in that kind of technological progress is what's going to ensure the safety and also superiority of the U.S. state, right? So what Pee-wee's Playhouse does with this moment of really rapid computerization in the 1980s is like they make it weird, right? So Pee-wee has all kinds of technologies in the Playhouse that we might think of as being computers or being like computers. There's Conky, his sort of robot that is basically in what we call today an artificial intelligence or AI that spits out the word of the day each day. And everyone in the Playhouse, when that word is said, screams together, and kids at home watching are supposed to scream too. There's Globy, who's the globe with a humanoid face on wheels, who has arms, and he kind of rolls around the Playhouse and helps Pee-wee with different kind of tasks related to information and geography. There's Magic Screen, who's basically like a talking iPad that Pee-wee can jump in and out of and do basic kind of computing processes. And these are moments in the show of computer animation that seemed really advanced and were quite expensive to produce in the 1980s. And all these kinds of devices are ways of Pee-wee like playing with these technologies that didn't exist in real life, but that people were kind of able to imagine for the first time as like on the horizon, whereas things that we might have soon. And indeed, they all like look very much like technologies that we do have today in the early 21st century, like iPads, like AI that we can talk to. So the show, like, I think modeled for us a different vision of what computing technologies could become if they were wacky, they didn't make sense, and they didn't have to make money for corporations.
Right. Yeah. And it's the make money for corporations part, right? That makes it that how it differs from what we actually got. Because you're right. These things are analogous to stuff we have today, but they're not mining data. They're not, it's, feeding advertisements based on whatever Pee-wee did that day. And in
Yeah, they were just
yeah,
joyful. They were just
yeah,
for fun. No one was trying to extract information about our bodies and our lives to feed an algorithm, right? It was about Pee-wee being in these really mutually affirming relationships with these technologies in his house that also had names and personalities. So really different model of like what it can look like to live with computers.
right. And it seems like, if we think again about this idea that the creatives behind the show were some of them were queer people. Excuse me. They were queer. Some of them were queer people, and not what they together. Regardless, they conspired to put certain themes in the show that, whether queer coded or not, quite honestly, they were just and maybe that's the idea of folks that felt like on the outside, trying to create an environment that's welcoming to anybody and certainly safe for the person that they all the center there, the Pee-wee, that they wind up creating a world that's wonderful for anybody. I guess if it's safe for queer people, it's safe for anybody, because what was my point going to be? My point was going to be that along those lines, that the human folks too, in a similar way, right, as the technology, are welcoming, inviting. They're diverse. They're non-judgmental. They accept Pee-wee, this man boy, for what he is. There's no even discussion about what that how that's odd.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? The human the characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we've been talking about is like the queer coding of this space is that it's a space that welcomes and celebrates people like as they are and doesn't try to force them to become or be something else. And that is like a way that the show celebrated outsiders and weirdos and nerds and eccentric people. I think part of the reason it gets this like cult status moving out of the 1980s and into the 1990s and even in the present, I would argue it still has a cult status,
Yes.
is like because it provided so many people who have never completely fit in with this like text they could identify with. And let's be honest, that's a lot of who makes up like nerdy fan cultures, is people who haven't felt kind of held and seen by the mainstream, right?
Right.
And that took place on this show as not just a politics about gender, which we've already talked about, but also a politics about race, right? So this was a show in the 1980s that had a broad cast that included many people of color as actors and characters on the show, where they got to just be that character and have a kind of full life and experience that wasn't solely defined by their race.
Right.
And that was like a very unusual thing in the 1980s on television. It's less unusual now, but unfortunately still kind of unusual. But this was a like thing that Pee-wee's Playhouse was doing that other television shows, children's television shows, weren't doing, with the exception of, I would say, Sesame Street was another example, right? And so the show really like created a space where difference could be unremarkable, and where people were able to like arrive at the Playhouse and show up as themselves and really like get to play.
I think it's interesting you pointed out that in the credits, they only mention the non-human characters, and they don't celebrate or acknowledge. And maybe it's just a function of the fact that they don't know what special guest was going to be on that weekend to create. But Pee-wee Herman himself does not get a name name placard or whatever you call it, a chyron with his name on it, right?
Yeah, one of the so basically the opening like theme song of the show, it names all of the main like puppet characters in the show, but it doesn't, as you said, list any of the human actors and their characters. And that in one of the interviews I read with some of the creative team behind the show was a deliberate decision and a request that Paul Reubens made about the opening of the show. Was like he wanted to center these non-human characters and their world. And like importantly, Pee-wee's Playhouse exists in a world that we are told is called Puppet Land. So it tells you like who comes to matter, who's important in this world, in this like environment, is like the puppets are centered, right? And the humans we get to be along for the ride, but we're not who's driving the action or determining the story.
Yeah, and as you point out, he doesn't live there. I never thought about this. He doesn't live in Pee-wee's Playhouse.
No, he leaves at the end. Yeah. It was actually like I hadn't thought about it either when I was a kid watching the show. It just wasn't, I don't know, I didn't make anything of it, but like going back to work on this book, which I like started working on in like deep COVID lockdown. And I think a lot of people watched Pee-wee's Playhouse again during that time because it was on Netflix briefly, and also like a lot of us just had a lot of time on our hands to binge watch television, old television. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh man, he even in the first season, he arrives at the house at the beginning of some of the episodes, and at the end of every episode through every season of the show, he leaves on his like scooter. So it's interesting to what I do with that in the book is think of it as like, what does it mean to have this space that's like, it's a domestic space, but it's a space that is for play, where you go not to like sleep or unwind after work, but to like do the like energetic labor of like playing with your friends and your kind of community that you share this space with, as if
Right.
it was your job, but your job that you love.
Right. And yeah, you're right. I didn't think about it that way. That's reinforcing this idea for children. And certainly, again, I was a teenager when I watched it. How important play is,
Yeah.
certainly for mental health and so on. Yeah.